presented us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, may we glorify thy holy name, and finally by thy mercy attain everlasting life. Amen. Introduction of guests. Recognize the member for Regina Rochdale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to this Assembly 54 grade 4 and 5 students from École St. Angela Merisi School. Give everyone a wave, you guys. They're accompanied by their teacher, Tara Fisher and Tyra Paget, and we have quite a few parents chaperones, so just to make sure that everyone's kept in line, I guess. We've got Gary Bear, Eden Daly, Kelly Lato, Crystal Worth, Neil Donaldson, Jillian Curti, Janelle Haro, Angel Bansal, Marina Ashakino. I hope I said that correctly. So we have an opportunity to meet with the students later on, and so we welcome them to the Legislative Assembly today. So thank you very much for coming to your Legislative Assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to join with the member for Rochdale in welcoming the school group in the West Gallery, but particularly their teacher, Ms. Tyra Paget. Ms. Paget, maybe if you would know, was actually a summer student in my office for a number of years as she was getting her degree. A very integral part of our team there, and I would count as a good friend. She became a very good friend over those years, Mr. Speaker. We miss her dearly in the office, but I know she's serving the children very well as their teacher. So I ask all members to join with me in welcoming the school group, but also Ms. Tyra Paget to her Legislative Assembly.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the West Gallery, it's my privilege to introduce a group of grade 8 and 9 students from the Elrose Composite School, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, they're accompanied by their teachers, Jeff Kingwell and Jill Drews, and also parent chaperones Chastity Vardy, Carrie Caldwell, and Travis Josdell, who's joining us on the Assembly floor, Mr. Speaker. These students had an opportunity to meet with them in my office earlier this morning. Mr. Speaker, I just want to point out, these students were on the road this morning at 5:30 in the morning, so they've had a very long day already. They've got a great day ahead of them. I'm just thrilled that they're here. Thanks so much to Jill and Jeff for arranging that. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask all members to please welcome them to their assembly.
Presenting petitions. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to present petitions on behalf of very concerned citizens as it relates to the harmful cuts, the callous cuts, the cuts that defy common sense to people living with disabilities and to families living on the tightest of budgets with children, Mr. Speaker, and of course that's the Sask Party government's cut to the rental housing supplement. The prayer reads as follows. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party government to immediately restore the Saskatchewan rental housing supplement. And these petitions today are signed by concerned citizens of Regina. I so submit.
Recognize the member for Carrot River Valley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to present a petition from citizens who are opposed to the federal government's decision to impose a carbon tax in the province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, we know the NDP opposition wants to cripple Saskatchewan with a carbon tax. They claim to want to help the poor. A carbon tax will not only increase your utility bills, but it will also increase your food prices. It'll make our farmers uncompetitive on the world market. It'll make our potash uncompetitive on the world market. Our oil rigs will move to the United States where there is no carbon tax. If that were to happen, where would the NDP opposition get the $2.5 billion a year for their leader's promises? Mr. Speaker, the leader of the opposition is literally living in la-la land. At least the Saskatchewan Party and our Premier will stand up to Justin Trudeau and say no to a carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan take the following action to cause the government of Saskatchewan to take the necessary steps to stop the federal government from imposing a carbon tax on the province. Mr. Speaker, this petition is signed by the citizens of Carrot River, Prince Albert, Saskatoon, and Nipawin. I so present.
Recognize the member for Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to get big money out of Saskatchewan politics. And the undersigned residents of the province of Saskatchewan want to bring to our attention the following: that Saskatchewan's outdated Election Act allows corporations, unions, and individuals, even those living outside of Saskatchewan, to make unlimited donations to our province's political party. And we know that, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Saskatchewan deserve to live in a fair province where all voices are equal and money can't influence politics. But we know, Mr. Speaker, Brad Wall, the former Sask Party leader, was the only premier in the country who collected a special cash bonus paid for by taxpayer-funded subsidies and portions of the millions in donations they collected from corporations and big money donors, including those from outside of the province. Mr. Speaker, we know that over the past 10 years, the Sask Party has collected $12.61 million in corporate donations, and of that, $2.7 million came from companies outside of Saskatchewan. Wow. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan politics should belong to Saskatchewan people, and we know that the federal government and the provinces of Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and British Columbia have moved to limit this influence and level the playing field by banning corporate and union donations to political parties. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the government of Saskatchewan call on the Sask Party to overhaul Saskatchewan campaign finance laws, to end out-of-province donations, to put a ban on donations from corporations and unions, and to put a donation limit on individual donations. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, the people signing this petition today come from Paddockwood, Canisno, Marceline, Grand Coulee, Lumsden, and Regina Beach. I do so present. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for critical workplace supports for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan has the very dubious distinction of having the highest rates of intimate partner violence amongst all the provinces in Canada. And we know that as legislators, we must do so much more to protect survivors of domestic violence. For many who experience this violence, the violence will follow them to their workplace, which is why the signatories to this petition are calling for 5 days of paid leave and up to 17 weeks of unpaid leave be made available to workers who are survivors of domestic violence, and that critical workplace supports made available to survivors of domestic violence be also made available to workers living with post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, this is what those who are on the front line of this crisis are calling for: the YWCA of Regina, PASS, as well as two examples of organizations who are calling for this. They recognize the importance of ensuring that those who are fleeing domestic violence are able to maintain their employment while they're transitioning to a safer living environment. Mr. Speaker, this is what we're calling for in our private members bill, Bill number 609. It's the fourth time, Mr. Speaker, that we've tabled these provisions in the last 2 years. It's time for the government to step up to the plate, do the right thing, and pass these provisions for these survivors. I'd like to read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows: respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call upon the Sask Party government to pass legislation to ensure critical supports in the workplace, including reasonable accommodation, paid and unpaid leave for survivors of domestic violence. Mr. Speaker, the individuals signing the petition today come from Regina. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statements by members. Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Mr. Speaker, the Cathedral Village Arts Festival is a creative celebration of community through the arts that I am so proud to have in my constituency. From May 21st to May 27th, Cathedral area residents invite their neighbors to celebrate the gifts that arts and culture bring to our community. This year, 97 events and 13 venues will take place, featuring over 120 artists and performers. The festival features visual arts, writing and poetry, crafts, and many impressive performances. The street fair provides a venue for over 300 artisans and vendors to sell their wares. The festival encourages children and youth and adults to create, participate, and enjoy the arts in all forms. The theme of this year's 27th annual festival is Expect the Unexpected. From humble but spirited roots back in 1991, the festival has grown immensely and now attracts upwards of 40,000 audience members, making it one of the largest festivals in the province. The CVAF operates as a committee of the Cathedral Area Community Association and is made possible by the efforts of over 150 volunteers from across the artistic, professional, and business spectrum. I ask all members to join me in thanking the CVAF team for their hard work in making this year's festival a success, and I invite everyone to come out to the festival this week.
As a member for Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the City of Saskatoon has permanently commemorated those who fought in the Afghanistan War. A plaque was added to the Saskatoon Cenotaph marking the North Saskatchewan Regiment's efforts in the 13-year war in Afghanistan. I was proud to join with my Royal Canadian Legion comrades as a military ceremony was held to mark this occasion. Mr. Speaker, the Afghanistan War was the longest combat mission in Canadian history. 158 Canadian soldiers were killed during this conflict, including 10 members from Saskatchewan and 2 from Saskatoon. Master Corporal Joshua Roberts and Corporal Shane Keating paid the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms. Their Silver Cross mothers joined us in the commemoration. Our soldiers honor their country, fighting in Afghanistan to protect the rights we have here in Canada and Saskatchewan. We are proud to remember our soldiers and honor their memory by having this plaque dedicated to those who made the ultimate sacrifice. It will serve as a place to recognize their service and pay our respects. Mr. Speaker, this plaque will be in addition to the 3 commemorative plaques already existing in the Saskatoon Cenotaph, including one for each of the 2 world wars as well as the Korean War. I ask all members to join me in honoring the 10 Saskatchewan soldiers who lost their lives fighting this war. We will remember them. Thank you.
As a member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize Congress 2018, which takes place this Saturday, May 26th to June 1st. Congress 2018 is being hosted by the University of Regina. The theme is Gathering Diversities. Typically spanning 7 days in late May and early June and attracting over 8,000 attendees, Congress is organized by the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences and is hosted by a different Canadian university each year. The Federation, the host university, scholarly associations, and partners develop a full week of presentations, workshops, panels, public lectures, cultural events, and receptions. Mr. Speaker, the annual Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences is the convergence of over 70 scholarly associations, each holding their annual conference under one umbrella. Now in its 87th year, this flagship event is much more than Canada's largest gathering of scholars. Congress brings together academics, researchers, policymakers, and practitioners to share findings, refine ideas, and build partnerships that will help shape the Canada of tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, the Federation promotes research and teaching for the advancement of an inclusive, democratic, and prosperous society. I ask all members to join with me in thanking all the organizers, the host committee, and in celebrating this incredible academic gathering, and of course, in welcoming all attendees to Regina. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As a member for Bigger Saskatchewan Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this month, Anita Silvernagle became a world champion representing Canada at the World Senior Curling Tournament in Östersund, Sweden. Silvernagle became a champion alongside her team, Patty Kirkscorn, Brenda Gertson, and Sherry Anderson. Mr. Speaker, Anita is from Bigger, and our community is very proud of her for representing Canada on the world stage. They dominated every team throughout the championship and committed to taking this winning attitude and strong gameplay all the way to the final. In the qualifier, Canada defeated Finland 10-6, moving on to the semifinal. Mr. Speaker, Anita's team was once again successful, defeating Switzerland in an exciting 7-5 win to earn themselves a spot in the championship game. The Canadian team then went on to beat the United States 5-4, earning themselves the title of world champions. Anita is one of the many curling champs to come out of Bigger, and along with her community, I'm proud and excited to see her add to our rich heritage of athletes, both in our town and our province. Mr. Speaker, I now ask that all members please join me in congratulating Anita Severnickel, Brenna Gertzen, Patty Kirkscorn, and Sherry Anderson on a successful win at the 2018 World Curling Championships. Thank you.
I recognize the member for Saskatoon Churchill Wildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to rise in this Assembly today and recognize an organization that goes above and beyond for the people of Saskatoon. The 4 Rotary Clubs of Saskatoon, Meewasin, North, Newtana and Riverside, continue to do inspiring work for their community. Mr. Speaker, for over 100 years, the Rotary Club has been committed to service above self, which strengthens communities and changes lives. I had the pleasure of bringing greetings at the Rotary Club's 100th anniversary celebration last summer, and I was reminded of the great work that the club has done. Most notably, the Restorative Action Plan and their work to eradicate polio. Mr. Speaker, the Restorative Action Plan was established in 2002 with the purpose of supporting and working with youth who needed help in addressing issues such as conflict, bullying, and crime. The program has helped countless young people. The polio eradication program, though much older as it was established 40 years ago, has done significant work helping to nearly eradicate the disease. Mr. Speaker, the variety of these 2 programs, from the length of time pursued to the nature of each, demonstrates the Rotary Club's commitment to the community of Saskatoon. On behalf of this entire Assembly, I'd like to thank the Rotary Club and all Rotarians for the time and energy they devote and commend them on a century of success. Thank you.
You're here. I recognize the member for Regina Rochdale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we know that Saskatchewan is home to many sports enthusiasts, great athletes and officials. I want to recognize and congratulate one of Regina's own, Stu Shearwater, who has begun his first season as a first-time Major League umpire. Stu Shearwater is one of only 3 Canadians to ever land a full-time job in the Major Leagues, and the only individual from Saskatchewan to do so. Since 2014, Shearwater has been called up for the Major Leagues and has been umpired more than 270 Major League games. However, March 29, 2018, marked his first regular season game as a full-timer and the beginning of a very exciting career chapter. Even while Stu was traveling to officiate in the Major League Baseball, he and his wife Danielle still call the Queen City his home. This is the city where Shearwater began his dream of being a Major League umpire. As a student at Balfour Collegiate, Stu was an avid sportsman, playing baseball and basketball, football, and sometimes dabbling in baseball. Before his professional career, Shearwater was a member of the Basketball Canadian National Umpire Program. He has worked in the 2005 Baseball Canadian Cup and in 2006 Under-21 National Championship. After 11 years in the majors, he progressed to the majors. Mr. Speaker, I hope everyone will join me in congratulating Stu on his impressive accomplishment. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Cutknife, Turtleford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on April 28th, Philip Favel of Sweetgrass First Nation celebrated his 96th birthday, making him one of the oldest surviving World War II veterans. A party was held at the Reserves Community Centre, complete with a birthday cake and a round dance to honour Mr. Favel. Mr. Favel served as a private in the armed forces in Europe during the war. Attending the celebration was General Jonathan Vance, Chief of Defence Staff of the Canadian Armed Forces, and Perry Bellegarde, Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Favel recounted a few stories from his time in the armed forces. In 1942, he trained in England before landing on Juno Beach on D-Day. During the war, he worked as a truck driver on the front lines, which at times was very dangerous. He recalled, "My windshield got smashed 3 times, but you had to keep going. You could not run back." Mr. Favel also took care of 2 children who were on the scene that day, which earned him a French medal to recognize his consideration. Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in recognizing the service and sacrifice of Philip Favel and all others who landed at D-Day to fight for our country. We are eternally grateful. Thank you.
Question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier was recently in Yellowknife where he signed a communique in support of a national pharmacare strategy. And that communique says, and I quote, Western Premiers agree on the need to continue work on new ways to increase access and lower the cost of drugs for Canadians. I was really pleased to see this advancement, especially since this declaration came just a few weeks after a 75-minute debate on pharmacare right here in this Assembly, where members opposite spent their time arguing against universal pharmacare. I wasn't really aware that the road to Damascus ran through Yellowknife, Mr. Speaker, but I'm thrilled that the Premier saw the light. And now that the Premier has signed the Western Premier's communique on pharmacare, I'm wondering if you would also be willing to sign the letter that we prepared to the federal government's pharmacare advisor and join New Democrats in calling for a fully funded universal pharmacare program for all Canadians.
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the member opposite for the question, and I'll make some comments as I have before on the work that's been initiated by the federal government with respect to a national pharmacare program here in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. And we've done one better than joint sign of a letter from a province, Mr. Speaker. We attended a meeting yesterday with provinces from across Western and Northern Canada and territories, pardon me, Mr. Speaker, from across Western and Northern Canada to talk just about this topic. And the member opposite is right. Western Premiers do agree on the need to continue the work, Mr. Speaker, on ensuring that we have access to our prescription drugs here in Western Canada. Mr. Speaker, there's 4 points. Focus, improving patient access should be the focus, as well as development on best available evidence, Mr. Speaker, potential risks, as well as we want provinces and territories, Mr. Speaker, must retain the responsibility for design and delivery, and federal funding must be available and must be ongoing, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's important to note that there is concern, Mr. Speaker, around that table, including in Saskatchewan, that any federal program would impact the already comprehensive program that drug program that we have here in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. We have a strong program. It's as comprehensive as any province across the nation of Canada, Mr. Speaker. It's a program that has evolved over decades, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's a program that the people of the province can be very proud of.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The benefits of a universal pharmacare program are clear and well documented. Better health outcomes, lower health system costs, fewer patients missing their medications, lower costs, and higher productivity for business. And the list goes on. You know, it's an issue that's been studied endlessly, and the results are very clear. Our healthcare system cannot fully deliver without universal pharmacare. But of course it has to be done right. As the members opposite have pointed out, it needs to improve upon existing programs, and our letter outlines the key principles that would make a truly universal, truly accessible pharmacare plan work for Saskatchewan patients. We know that provinces can't do this on their own. Federal funding and leadership are needed here in Saskatchewan. We should be crystal clear in our call for a fully funded national pharmacare program with first dollar coverage for all prescription drugs based on an evidence-based formulary. So I'm asking today, will the Premier join me in calling for that today and sign our letter, adding clear recommendations from Saskatchewan and making sure that the federal plan meets the need of Saskatchewan patients?
I recognize the Premier.
And what I'm saying here today, Mr. Speaker, is this government under the previous Premier and this Premier, Mr. Speaker, have done much more than sign any letter, Mr. Speaker, to the federal government. In fact, Saskatchewan under the previous Premier was the co-lead, along with Prince Edward Island, Mr. Speaker, on the Health Innovation Working Group, Mr. Speaker, which helped drive down drug costs by millions of dollars across the nation of Canada, including in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. I do agree, and premiers around the table did agree, Mr. Speaker, that we do need a solid partner in the federal government, not just in a pharmacare program, not just in our drug coverage, Mr. Speaker, but in the health system in general, Mr. Speaker. At the point of inception, Mr. Speaker, here in the nation of Canada, our health coverage was a 50-50. We had a 50-50 partner with the federal government, Mr. Speaker. In this province, where now the federal government funding is down to about 21% of our health care expenses here in the province, Mr. Speaker. It was noted later in the communique, Mr. Speaker, that the health needs of Canadians are not well served when provincial and territorial governments do not receive fair and sustainable sustainable funding through the Canada Health Transfer, Mr. Speaker. There's a broader conversation to happen here on the partnership between our federal government, our provinces and territories, Mr. Speaker, on sharing health care costs in general, not just with a pharmacare program.
Recognized Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I've been pleased to see the significant development of the Premier's position on pharmacare. Originally so reluctant to discuss the topic, now joining with the Western Premiers to call for some of the details in that strategy. Now that's a good step, but I think we need to go further. Look more and more into exactly how we do the best evidence-based quality program, and that's really the basis of the letter we've put together. I'd be very happy to sit down with the Premier, Minister of Health, look in detail at how to make sure that that letter best influences the process that's ongoing, Mr. Speaker. Happy to do that review. I'd also really encourage the Premier to consider a change, because we've seen a big increase in the premiums for seniors and the cost they're paying. Seniors often on 5-6 medications at a time, paying $25 per prescription. That adds up very quickly. So I guess now with this newfound intrigue and interest in pharmacare, will the Premier also be willing to review the amount that seniors are being forced to pay for those medications that they so dearly need?
Recognize the Premier.
Speaker, as I said this government, Mr. Speaker, under this Premier, under the previous Premier, has gone far beyond sending a letter to the federal government, Mr. Speaker. We were co-lead on the Health Innovation Working Group, Mr. Speaker. I was representing the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, on a discussion in pharmacare yesterday in Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be going to the Council of Federation meeting where we'll be discussing in further detail, Mr. Speaker, the opportunities that we have as a nation, Mr. Speaker, to move forward, ensuring that we are not being offered a program that is much less than the comprehensive program that we already have, Mr. Speaker. And that representation was also brought by our two health ministers, Mr. Speaker, who just last week met with Mr. Hoskins, the lead, Mr. Speaker, on the National Pharmacare Program. Mr. Speaker, they explained in detail the comprehensive plan we have in the province of Saskatchewan. I believe Mr. Hoskins believed with the vast reach of the plan here, Mr. Speaker, as it is a strong plan, among the strongest in the nation of Canada. Mr. Speaker, evolved over multiple governments and multiple decades, Mr. Speaker. But again, the people of this province can be proud of the representation that they have on this file, Mr. Speaker, and proud of the comprehensive plan that they have in the province of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, just to remind the Premier, the question was about the cost and growing cost for seniors of their prescriptions and the need to review that particular fee. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we had an opportunity to question current cabinet ministers and former Sask Party leadership candidates about where they stand when it comes to a judicial inquiry into the GTH, something they'd expressed enthusiasm for during the leadership race. That's right. Unfortunately, the members opposite seem to have conveniently gone silent on the commitments they made just a few months ago. Shameful. The GTH is failing to meet expectations, not because it's a bad concept, but because this government has failed in so many ways in its responsibility to provide transparency to the public. Failed to shine a light on the mismanagement that has gone on, and taxpayers, as a result, are being stuck with the bill. My question to the Premier is, will he take a cue from his fellow leadership contestants and commit to a judicial inquiry on the GTH as they did during the contest, or will he join them and remain silent on this pressing issue?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question on the Global Transportation Hub, Mr. Speaker. A generational investment on behalf of the people of the province of Saskatchewan that was started under the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. It's been executed under members of this side of the government over the last decade, Mr. Speaker, and the importance of that facility, Mr. Speaker, is as important today as it has ever been. The free flow of goods in and out of our province, Mr. Speaker, and there have been questions, fair questions around the land procurement in that area, Mr. Speaker. Those questions were referred to, I believe, to the Conflict of Interest Commissioner originally, then to the provincial auditor, Mr. Speaker. They're now with the justice in the province of Manitoba, Mr. Speaker. It's been referred out of the province. And Mr. Speaker, I have never precluded that upon the return of a decision by the Department of Justice in Manitoba, Mr. Speaker, that there would not be further action. But we will be waiting till we hear back from the Department of Justice, Mr. Speaker. Never precluded further action, Mr. Speaker, but have also said that we wouldn't be acting further until we have a reply, Mr. Speaker, from the Department of Justice in Manitoba.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Last week, the Sask Party government appointed 13 legislative secretaries, and with these appointments, those 13 government backbenchers get top-ups to their salaries. But, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to our kids' classrooms and the teachers who work with those kids every day, the Sask Party government doesn't have the same generosity.
Right.
They've refused to commit to funding the teachers' contract. Mr. Speaker, that this will be an agreement that's bargained in good faith with teachers across the province, whereas the raises that they gave to their own colleagues were done with the stroke of a pen behind closed doors. Mr. Speaker, how can the Sask Party government justify giving themselves salary top-ups when they refuse to fund the teachers' contract?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I've stood in this House on a number of occasions to talk about the teacher's contract, Mr. Speaker, which we have agreed that we will negotiate in good faith, Mr. Speaker. We'll participate at the table during arbitration, Mr. Speaker. But to suggest that this government hasn't made a commitment to kids' classrooms, Mr. Speaker, is laughable. We've committed $30 million in this budget, Mr. Speaker, in addition to the $7.5 million in in-year funding that was provided to school divisions, Mr. Speaker, prior to the introduction of the budget, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to have conversations with teachers, Mr. Speaker, with school boards, Mr. Speaker. It's our intention to make sure that we meet the requirements, meet the needs of children in the classroom, Mr. Speaker, and that's going to be an ongoing conversation that we have, Mr. Speaker, with trustees, with parents, and with teachers, Mr. Speaker. And when there's a contract to consider, Mr. Speaker, this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, will consider that contract, but I can guarantee you one thing, Mr. Speaker, teachers will be paid.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
To know that the teachers will be paid, Mr. Speaker, but the question is, will this government fully fund that payment? The fact is that they are topping up their backbenchers' salaries. In 2016, the Sask Party government refused to fully fund the teachers' contracts, costing school boards $9 million.
Order, please. Recognize the member.
That cost school boards $9 million, and school divisions were forced to cut resources from their classrooms. Mr. Speaker, it is students who suffer when this government refuses to fund those contracts. Although bargaining is ongoing in Saskatchewan, the Sask Party government controls the purse strings for education, and to date, they've refused to fully commit to fund this contract. The minister can spin it all he wants, but it's on them. When can we expect a full commitment to fully fund that teacher's contract?
Hear, hear.
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Just to correct the member, Mr. Speaker, this government has not refused to fund the teacher's contract, Mr. Speaker. When that contract is presented, Mr. Speaker, whether it's negotiated at the table, Mr. Speaker, or whether a presentation is made through the arbitration process, Mr. Speaker, we will give full consideration to that process, Mr. Speaker. But at the present time, there is no contract to fund. And when there is one, Mr. Speaker, we will give due consideration to that contract, Mr. Speaker, and the responsibilities of this government, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that we fund public education properly, Mr. Speaker. That includes classrooms, Mr. Speaker. That includes the teachers, Mr. Speaker. So we will give consideration once that contract is presented, Mr. Speaker, for ratification, and we'll give it full consideration, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Speaker, our teachers deserve better, our school boards deserve better, and moreover, our kids deserve better. They shouldn't be second in line to the Sask Party government backbenchers. And with all the rain this morning, the infrastructure issues at Argyle School are more evident than ever. Water is pouring inside the school, through the windows, through the walls. Water fountains are spilling over with backed up water. And children's art projects on the walls are getting sopping wet. We've asked before, but we've heard no real answers. What is the plan to deal with infrastructure issues in our schools, and how long will these students have to sit in these conditions?
Recognize the Minister of Education.
Speaker. Speaker, I was made aware of the issues at Argyle School this morning, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell you that the school division, and I've quoted this on the floor of the House before, says that the school division has said, well, this is one of our older schools. It continues to be repaired at a level that we can afford without compromising the safety of anyone in the building, Mr. Speaker, and there's no structural issues with the building at Argyle, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, for the opposition, Mr. Speaker, to question this government's commitment on education capital is another laughable question, Mr. Speaker. And look at the commitments that this government has made to education capital, Mr. Speaker, in this city alone. Ecole St. Elizabeth, St. Kateri, St. Nicholas, Ecole Wascana Plains, Ecole Harbour Landing, Plainsview, Sacred Heart, Ecole Connaught, and Scott Collegiate, Mr. Speaker. This is our commitment. We know that there's some challenges with a number of schools in this city, Mr. Speaker. We continue to work with school divisions in developing our capital plan, Mr. Speaker. This school is on our capital plan, Mr. Speaker, for replacement. And as we move forward, Mr. Speaker, in developing future budgets, Mr. Speaker, due consideration will be given to the replacement of the school.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Deputy Premier should say that to the students at Argyle School or the parents over at Argyle School.
Hear, hear.
Last week, I asked the Minister to speak to his cuts to the rental housing supplement. Cuts that target people with disabilities who face real barriers to access housing that meets their needs. And again, he chose not to answer the question and offered a red herring about vacancy rates. So I'll ask again, Mr. Speaker, of the 3,000 units that are apparently vacant, how many of those are designed for people with disabilities? And of those specialized units, how many are vacant?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I have discussed in this House many times and out in the Rotunda and in committee, the rental market has changed, Mr. Speaker. We have seen a 9% vacancy rate in the rental market, Mr. Speaker. This is a very prudent time that we look at all of the supplements and to see if there are some opportunities for us to be able to redirect some of that funds. What we have been able to do, Mr. Speaker, in this budget, I'm very proud of, is to be able to commit $10.4 million to those who are most vulnerable in our communities. We're able to work with the community-based organizations for the disability side of things, Mr. Speaker, and we're very proud of what we've done on that side of things. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Here, no answer to a very basic question again, and people living with disabilities deserve an answer to that. This government's analysis of the available housing stock, we heard it again today, simply isn't accurate, and it ignores the unique needs of people living with disabilities. Those who are living on income assistance programs in Saskatchewan are faced with discrimination, unable to find adequate housing, and experience homelessness at alarming rates in this province. So I'll ask the Minister another question that I asked him last week. Can the Minister guarantee that people living with disabilities who need this government support will be offered a housing unit that meets their need within the Housing Authority? And most importantly, why doesn't he just reverse this callous cut?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to get on the record, Mr. Speaker, some of the investments that we have had in our housing. $724 million to develop 11,000 units, Mr. Speaker. An additional $56 million to repair 4,300 units, Mr. Speaker. One of the things that we are extremely proud of is the units that we have built for the transition of Valley View, Mr. Speaker. We have taken Valley View, which was an aging facility, and allocated funds all across Saskatchewan for people to be able to move back within their communities. If the member opposite is questioning our commitment to the people with disability in housing, I would ask him just to look at the transition of Valley View, how that has been over the last few years. And Mr. Speaker, if he has any more questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, it's pathetic. We've asked these questions that are direct and straightforward, and not a single answer from that minister. Right. Of the apparent 3,000 vacant units, how many of those are designed for people living with disabilities? And secondly, will he assure people living with disabilities that need government support that they'll receive a housing unit that meets their needs?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, we work with all of our clients on a case-by-case basis to be able to meet their needs. The 3,000 chronically vacant units that we have are all across Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. We have units in Saskatoon and in Regina that are chronically vacant, and we will continue to work with our clients to be able to meet their basic needs, Mr. Speaker, and that includes people with disabilities and also people with families, Mr. Speaker, single individual units, as well as seniors, Mr. Speaker. We work with our clients on an ongoing basis to be able to meet their needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Good job.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Another response, another non-answer, Mr. Speaker. Of the 3,000 units that are apparently vacant, how many of those are designed for people with disabilities?
Recognize the Minister of Social Services.
Mr. Speaker, I did answer the question. I answered it 2 or 3 times, Mr. Speaker. Out of the 3,000 units that are across our province, we have an aging inventory within Sask Housing, Mr. Speaker. We have sold units to be able to repurpose those for single moms, also for people with disabilities. If the member from Saskatoon Centre wants to keep chirping at me from his seat, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite also had 6 hours in committee to ask me these questions, and I answered every question that he asked. I tabled documents that the member asked for during committee, Mr. Speaker. This is the first time that this member has got to his feet and asked this question, Mr. Speaker, and I'd really like to know why he didn't ask that in the 6 hours that we had in committee. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Speaker, we saw pathetic responses from that minister in committee. This question was asked to that minister last week. He needs to tune in, be attentive to his file, and answer to the most vulnerable in this province. But shifting gears just a little bit, instead of more nonsense from that minister, more non-answers, Mr. Speaker, shifting gears. As we head into these summer months, many post-secondary students are relying on their summer jobs to try and make enough money so that they can pay for their next year of school. And with the cost of living increasing and tuition costs increasing, students will need to work even more to try to save up enough money. But, Mr. Speaker, youth employment has dropped drastically over the last year, making it harder and harder for students to find jobs and to fund their education at a time where tuition fees have been hiked in significant ways because of the cuts of that government. Mr. Speaker, how will students be able to save for school, that ever-increasing cost of school, if they can't find a summer job?
Recognize the Minister of Trade.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is that we have seen record employment growth in this province that has benefited everybody in this province over the course of the last decade. Over 60,000 jobs have been created over that period of time, Mr. Speaker, the second best job creation record in the entirety of the country, Mr. Speaker. And you contrast that with the members opposite in their last decade in government, who had the worst job creation record of any party, of any government in the entire country, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to talk about the economic record of this government, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to talk about the 160,000 newcomers that have made Saskatchewan their home over the course of the last decade, a rate of growth that we have seen in this province not since the 1930s, Mr. Speaker. Contrast that rate of population growth with their record, Mr. Speaker, of out-migration, of people having to flee this province. You want to talk about youth employment, Mr. Speaker? On this side of the House, we've actually created jobs. On this side of the House, on that side of the House, they've chased youth out of Saskatchewan.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
You're coming at us. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, for months, Mr. Speaker, in fact, for this entire legislative session, concerned citizens of our province have been camped outside the legislative building, raising their concerns about our justice system, our child welfare system, and the impact of colonialism in our province. I've been there a few times to meet with the folks who are camped there, and I know other members from both sides of the Assembly have been out as well, gathering informally, discussing what's on their minds. In meeting with them again today, really what I heard from the people who are staying there is that they want to meet with the Premier. They want to sit down and just have a conversation with the Premier. Nothing fancy, nothing formal, just meet with the Premier. It's a simple request, and a request for which they've been patient, persistent, and respectful. Mr. Speaker, after question period, I'm going to head out again. I'm going to head down the steps of the legislative building and go and visit with the folks who are sitting there, hear their concerns, and see how we can walk forward together in the spirit of reconciliation. I'm just wondering if the Premier would be willing to join me. Is this a point, Mr. Speaker, on which the Premier and I could find some common ground, work to walk forward in reconciliation together, go and sit down and have a conversation with these folks who've been waiting so patiently for that discussion?
Recognize the Minister of Central Services.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Speaker. I'd first like to say that we value the health and safety of everyone who uses Wascana Centre, and we recognize the freedom of expression as a fundamental right. Wascana Centre is home to hundreds of events and rallies and even demonstrations every year, and we have a number of bylaws and policies in place that restrict camping, fires, signage, and setting up structures. A permit is required for all activities, and indeed we have been in contact with the group outside. They have asked for a meeting. If members would be quiet, I'd answer their question. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. They've asked for a meeting. The Minister of Justice and I have agreed to meet with them, and we've proposed a number of dates. I understand that we've come to an agreement next week. We will sit down and talk about it. But in the fundamental question about Wascana Park, there needs to be maintenance. We will be turning sprinklers on and things like that, so they will have to move out. The Minister of Government Relations has had respectful meetings with First Nations on many different levels and will continue to do so. And we look forward to the meeting next week. Thank you.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Recognize the chair of the Committee on the Economy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on the Economy to report that it has considered certain estimates and to present its fifth report. I move that the fifth report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be now concurred in.
It has been moved by the Chair of the Standing Committee on the Economy that the fifth report of the Standing Committee on the Economy be now concurred in. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies to report Bill number 92, the Saskatchewan Telecommunications Amendment Act 2017, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? Recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill, and the bill be now read the third time.
Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 92, and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? Minister may now proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
Moved by the Minister that Bill number 92 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on Crown and Central Agencies to report Bill number 93, the Saskatchewan Telecommunications Holding Corporation Amendment Act 2017, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? Recognize the Minister.
I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill, and the bill be now read the third time.
Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 93, and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move the bill be now read the third time, and the bill be passed under its title.
It's been moved by the Minister that Bill number 93 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Assembly ready for the question. It's a pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Recognize the Deputy House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Orders of the day. Written questions.
Question number 287 asked by Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the answers to question 287.
Table 287.
Question number 288 asked by Ms. Sproul.
Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to questions 288 through 289.
Order 288, 289.
Question number 290 asked by Ms. Sproul.
No. Is that it? Is that it? Sorry, is government whip done with written questions?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answer to question 290.
Order 290.
Question number 291 asked by Ms. Sproul.
Recognize government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answer to question 291.
Order 291.
Question number 292 asked by Ms. Sproul.
Recognize government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answers to question 292.
Order 292.
Number 293 asked by Ms. Sproul.
Recognize government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to order the answer to question 293.
Order 293. Recognize the Deputy House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In order to facilitate the work of committee both this morning and this afternoon, I move that this House do now adjourn.
Deputy Government House Leaders move to adjourn the House. Pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House stands adjourned until Monday at 1:30 p.m.